Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of How Did We Not Know That? My name's Nat,
My name's Jack.
and today we have another super exciting episode about Supreme Court cases.
Yeah, we love the U.S. Supreme Court. All right, so today we're presenting on the Loving versus Virginia Supreme Court case of 1967.
Ooh, I've heard about this case.
Yeah, it's a popular one.
Yeah, didn't they just make a movie about it?
My sister asked me the same thing. I think that, they must have recently. This is also a really easy Supreme Court case to remember. So Loving versus Virginia is it is the case that outlawed banning interracial marriage.
Yeah.
So it's like love wins. And this was the case that in 2015, when same-sex marriage was granted, the rights were granted, same-sex marriage had equal rights. Because there's like double negatives when I say like this outlawed the ban of, so it's like confusing to me. But yeah, it outlaws the ban on same-sex marriage. So there's same-sex. Anyways, that case that happened in 2015 is heavily influenced on the same argument that was made in this case.
Okay, I see.
That makes sense, yeah. Okay, so Loving versus Virginia, 1967. So to talk about this case, we have to go all the way back to 1924, and we're going to talk a bit about something that they thought was needed in Virginia, but it was called the Racial Integrity Act of 1924. I don't understand why something like this existed, but now that I do research, I'm like, okay, I'm not surprised. It was arranged by the General Assembly of Virginia, and this act reinforced racial segregation by prohibiting interracial marriage and classifying interracial marriages, but only in regards to a white person and then anyone colored. So if you're colored and this other person's colored, you guys can marry. Like if you're Hispanic, you're Black, you guys can marry, that's fine. Between white people and anyone who's not white, that was outlawed.
I did not realize that. I thought it was just, wow, okay.
No, it was just white people and anyone who was colored.
Yikes.
So during this time in 1924, interracial marriage was still a law handled by the states. So a lot of there are some states that were more open to it. Like Ohio had interracial marriage in 1884, I believe. That was already a thing. Yeah, a lot of the northern states already had interracial marriages fine.
Really? I would not.
Yeah.
I would have thought it would have been a lot later.
Yeah, no, I was surprised too. The northern states had it by 1884, and then states like California out west that maybe became acquired a little later had it by 1967. But then like in 1924 to 1967, like they were allowing it, but then it was like not until 1967 that it finally got outlawed. And all of these southern states, this is just your history, they had this for until the Supreme Court ruled that it's outlawed. Which, spoiler alert, yeah, we outlawed this ban.
Yeah.
So now we're in 1958. So I'm going to introduce you to two of our characters. There's a girl named Mildred Jeter. She's an African-American woman, and a white man named Richard Lovings. So they fell in love as young teenagers in rural Virginia. And in the summer of 1958, Mildred was about 18 at the time, and she discovers she's pregnant with Richard Lovings' child. So their child, he's the father, and Richard is white. So they decide to get married, but since it's still banned, interracial marriage is banned in Virginia, they decide to go to DC where it's legal and get married there. So they get married in DC and they return to Virginia. Shortly after, and this was in June 1958, they got married. And so they come back to Virginia, and shortly after, on July 11th, 1958 at 2 a.m., the local sheriff and cops come in, and they just like break and enter into their house and break into like their bedroom as well in the middle of the night and arrest them and they end up going to jail. So they're charged on violation of the Racial Integrity Act and are not, yeah, they got charged on that. Sorry.
Yeah.
My notes are funny. So they both plead guilty to it, and they're sentenced to either 1 year of prison, or they can be banished from Virginia for 25 years. And if they return after the 25 years, they can't be married.
Whoa, that's a really long time.
I know. I read that and I was like, eh. But like, that's a really long time, especially when you have family and friends in
Yeah.
Virginia.
Because at first, my first thought was like, is Virginia that nice that like you would be super upset about never going back?
Yeah. Well, I get it now too. I get it.
Or,
Oh, go ahead.
oh no,
Sorry,
it's
what do you think?
like if your whole family lives there, then yeah, that's awful. Then you can't be with your family. But
Right. I get it now. At first, when I read that, I was like, okay, I just leave Virginia. But now that I'm older, when you leave a place for 25 years, that's your whole life. You don't get to see anyone.
up and
Yeah. And they grew up there. That's like where they live. That's where they work. That's their home. So, anyways, they moved to DC and they really don't like it. They miss the fam, they miss their friends. So they decide 5 years into their sentencing, they're going to come back and visit. And again, they get arrested when they enter Virginia for traveling together.
wow.
Yeah. And then, so Mildred, they have to go back to DC. Mildred gets like pretty tired about it, and she decides to write a letter to attorney Robert Kennedy, and this is the brother of John F. Kennedy, who was president at the time. But they write to Robert Kennedy, and Robert Kennedy in 1963 and 1964-ish, I tried to gather info, and some people said 1963, some people said 1964, but Mildred writes the letter around that time, and Robert Kennedy refers to her to the American Civil Liberties Union, so ACLU, which, yeah, it still exists today. This is if anyone remembers the 2016 elections, everyone started donating to ACLU. And ACLU it's a nonprofit organization that was founded in the 1920s to defend and preserve the individual rights and liberties guaranteed to every person in this country by the Constitution and laws of the United States.
Okay.
So the letter gets forwarded to ACLU, and 2 attorneys reach out to the Lovings and they take on their case. So the 2 attorneys are Bernie Cohen and Philip Hirschkopf. I hope I said that right. And they file a motion on behalf of the Lovings to the Virginia Caroline County Circuit Court, requesting to allow their marriage since denying it breaks the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. And I'll get into explaining that later into the episode. But they end up losing the trial court, which is like where they were first like pled guilty and had their sentencing. And then after that, it gets escalated up to the Virginia Supreme Court, and they lose again. So after that, it goes up to the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court. And during this time, the Lovings were getting a lot of social media attention too that they didn't really want. They had like a whole article published in Time magazine. Yeah, because this is also, so civil rights movement, for anyone who's not familiar, the civil rights movement in America, that happened like 50s to 60s. So 1963, 1964, this is like right before the civil rights movement. And like, this is one of those things where people or state governments are still trying to enforce segregation through marriage. So this is during that time.
Okay.
So they get a lot of social media attention they didn't really want. So they don't even show up to the U.S. Supreme Court hearings or any of that because they just didn't want it. They're just 2 people in love. They didn't want to deal with all of this.
Also, like, I'm sure like their safety was being threatened as well.
Ooh, tea.
Yeah.
Very true. Okay, so
they just want to be a regular, normal married couple.
I know. It's such a privilege to think that wasn't your right. Which I mean, 2015, we just had same-sex marriage, and now like future generations will be like, what? That was outlawed?
Yeah.
And in some countries, it is still outlawed. I'm sure in some countries they outlaw interracial marriage too. So I don't even know if this is a fully resolved problem in the world. And okay, so it gets escalated to the U.S. Supreme Court, and on April 10th of 1967, the court engages in like the debate that they have. So the issue was whether or not a state law prohibiting marriage exclusively on the basis of race was constitutional under the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment grants citizenship to all people born or naturalized in the United States, including former slaves, and guarantees all citizens equal protection of the laws.
Yeah.
I feel like that should say equal protection under the law. It's fine. That was a direct quote, so it just sounds weird. Okay, and then there are two clauses within the 14th Amendment that the argument really used, and it was the Equal Protection Clause, which basically forces a state to govern impartially, so you can't draw distinctions between individuals solely on differences that are irrelevant or to a legitimate governmental objective. So basically, equal protection, states are supposed to protect their citizens equally.
Yeah.
And then the Due Process Clause it states that nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So basically, this means, it's a fancy way of saying an individual's right to marry cannot be invaded by the state.
Yeah. Okay. So also, is this 14th Amendment, where is Title IX, like, under all this? Like, Title IX is like discriminate.
No, what's Title IX?
Isn't Title IX like employers or others can't discriminate based on like gender, race, ethnicity?
Oh, I don't know. When did that come? Was that later on, or was it
time that Title IX was created after the Civil Rights Movement?
Yeah, that wasn't involved in this case.
Yeah, I don't know where Title IX fits under the legal scheme.
We'll look that up.
Yeah, I hear about it a lot in terms of education, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we can look into that. I feel like that would be a good another episode.
Ooh.
Branch off of this. So, but actually, another, maybe that's related to this one too. Another thing that the court also uses to argue against it is they apply strict scrutiny. Have you heard of that?
Like, is it kind of similar? I guess like strict scrutiny is like they have to examine it very carefully.
Yeah, kind of. So they basically, the state's laws that involve racial classification, they have to pass strict scrutiny. So this gets applied to any affirmative action policy. It has to be, there are two things it has to fulfill. It has to be necessary to further a compelling state interest, and it also has to be narrowly tailored to further that interest.
Okay.
So if you led, like, affirmative action in college is that like wants you to meet a certain quota for African American students or Asian American students, that passes both of the qualifications. So that's why something related to race can be enforced.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Strict scrutiny.
Mm-hmm. So those are that was what the Supreme Court, that was like their argument, or people against it, that was their argument. And the Virginia's argument was that a more deferential analysis should apply because the state punishes members of both races equally. And then the court, what do you think about that?
I mean, yeah, I feel like that's a really sleazy way. I don't know, like, I guess technically both races are being affected, but I don't agree with, no,
Right, it feels wrong. It feels a little wrong.
I feel like that's like, such a like technical, like, well, how about if it affects both races, then like they just shouldn't affect either race at all, and just let them be happy,
Exactly. No, I think that's a good starting argument. I think the people in the court did a little better, though. They basically rejected that claim, and they noted that the law draws a racial classification on its face by forbidding international marriages with white people. So strict scrutiny does apply because it's just white people are not supposed to mix with whatever, like, other race, but they're okay with colored people mixing. So the court eventually rules that the anti-miscegenation law, which is just like that's the the Racial Integrity Act of 1924. They're miscegenation laws. So it just like prevents people from mixing races. And they ruled that that had no other purpose than to perpetuate racial discrimination.
Yeah.
And they concluded that the law had been created to further white supremacy and reasoned that the restriction on freedom to marry violates the principal purpose of the Equal Protection Clause, which is to eliminate state discrimination.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, that is, I agree. That's a way better argument.
I think he would have gotten to it eventually, but that was my first thought too. I was like, okay, Virginia has a point.
Like, I don't like it, but yeah.
Yeah, like it feels wrong. You know it's wrong, but you don't know. You need some more time to come up with why that's wrong, and then you'd eventually get to that argument that they came up with.
Wow.
Okay. So on June 12th, 1967, the court announces unanimously, so everyone was like, scrap it. They sided with the Lovings, overturning their conviction and ruling Virginia's interracial marriage ban as unconstitutional.
Woo-hoo.
So Chief Justice Earl Warren rules that the state interracial marriage bans violate both the Equal Protection Clause and the Due Process Clause. And a direct quote from him is, "The 14th Amendment requires that the freedom of choice to marry not be restricted by invidious? I feel like that's a typo.
Yeah.
Is that a real word?
Invidious?
Invidious?
I feel like I've never heard of that, but
Restricted by, let's call it state. To marry not be restricted by state racial discrimination. Under our Constitution, the freedom to marry or not marry a person of another race resides with the individual and cannot be infringed by the state."
okay.
So, yay, it's officially outlawed. So then all of the states are then outlawed from any type of race. So from then on, the states are all then outlawed from any type of marriage discrimination law on the basis of race.
Okay.
So the Supreme Court's ruling invalidated. I am literally having such a hard time talking today. The Supreme Court's ruling invalidated interracial marriage bans that were in 16 states at that time.
Wow, so it wasn't just Virginia, it was 16.
Yeah, it wasn't just Virginia. So 16 states still had interracial marriage bans, mostly the South. Again, sorry, this is your history.
Yeah.
And those states actually kept it on the law books, but they couldn't enforce it anymore after it was overturned. So like a lot of the southern states not happy about it, so they just kept it to spite, but
you can't
you can't enforce it. It's now federally outlawed. And fun fact, sorry Alabama, but Alabama was actually the last one to fully remove it in 2000. So eventually southern states remove it from the books. 2000s.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Which I think it says a lot. Well, we'll open it for discussion soon.
Yeah.
But yeah, this helps a lot with the civil rights movement pushing us forward. And this case, like we said earlier, also helped pave the path for future cases like the 2013 United States versus Windsor case and the 2015 Obergefell versus Hodges for same-sex marriage rights case.
Wow.
And then another fun fact, interracial couples today, we actually saw a huge, well, it's actually not that big, but we see an increase in interracial marriages from 3% to 17% in 2015, which is honestly not that much. 17% is kind of small.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's a lot smaller than I would have.
Yeah, people were saying it's a huge jump. And I was like, is it?
17%? Really?
Yeah, that makes me think a lot differently about my parents if it's only 17% in 2015.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And I think with Alabama not removing it till 2000s, it just goes to show that, yeah, people say, I hear this all the time, like racism is in the past and we need to get over it. But things don't get lifted till the 2000s. Also, this case, this wasn't banned till 1968.
Yeah.
So, wait, 8 or 7? 1967? Oh my gosh. So that's not that far off. That's less than a generation. You could be born into like a family who really believes no interracial marriage and just raised that way. Like it's not gone.
were born like around in the
Yeah,
60s. So that's wild. Yeah.
yep, those thoughts can be passed on. So now I want to ask you, because fun fact, Nat and I are actually both children from interracial couples.
Hey.
So we're
Yeah.
going to open it for discussion.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Okay. Uh, like a discussion, just talk about, I guess.
Yeah, I just want to ask you kind of like, how do you feel about knowing that
Wow.
this was a ban for so long? And how do you feel like as a mixed person who's come out of that, knowing that your parents wouldn't have had that right before?
Yeah, I think like what you said earlier about looking at the timeline, like when my parents were born, I think my dad was born, one of my parents was born in 1965. But they were born in like I guess before this court case even was like even, oh my gosh. My parents were born before this Supreme Court case. So I think it's really strange to think about how when they were first born it was like illegal for them to even like be together. And so that's really crazy to think, because I don't know, when we talk about it in history class or in whatever context, like it seems like it was so long ago, but it's really not. And I think it's really weird to think of a world where like my parents couldn't be together, because I don't know, it's just we're all regular people.
Right. It feels weird. And to me, I think like, I don't know if you felt this way growing up. I'm very lucky to have like both sets of my grandparents are very open-minded, and like I never felt like I was different because I was mixed,
Yeah.
like with my family at least. But I watched a video um about these couples who were interracial, and they were like today, this was released in 2017, and they were talking about what it was like it was celebrating the Loving versus Virginia case anniversary. They're talking about their relationships today and things they go through. And a lot of them said that they weren't accepted by the other person's family. And sometimes they're like estranged with their parents because they really don't believe they should be together.
Yeah. I think I'm really lucky. My grandparents on both sides were very accepting. And I think I'm really lucky to be coming from a multi ethnic family, because growing up in a household where we have, multiple ethnicities and multiple heritages and cultures, like I think I'm really lucky to grow up with that background, because I think it really shaped my worldly perspectives and kind of how I see the rest of the world. Um, and I love it so much. Like I have so many different cultures that I can learn about, and so many things I could share with other people. I really love talking about both of my heritages. So it just makes me so sad to think about all the people in the past who didn't have not only the right, but like their safety was threatened because of the person they loved. And it's really upsetting to think about.
Yeah. And still today. So like that was outlawed, but still today people
With same-sex marriage
deal with
in 2015. And so
mm-hmm. and all of the problems that they went through too. And I agree with you. Like I really love being mixed. I think it's the best thing about me. But growing up, I definitely, and probably because I grew up in rural Ohio, which Ohio is pretty forward compared to the southern states. Like we're pretty more accepting. And even in rural Ohio, it's more closed-minded than most, like when it comes to a lot of issues on that. And growing up, I always felt like not not accepted really for being mixed. I always didn't feel like I was good enough for either side, which could just be like mixed experiences.
I completely
Um,
agree with that.
yeah, and I just want to cut the southern states some slack too, because I think you don't get to choose where you're born, right? And if you're born into a state where everyone around you, it's like outlawed to mix, that's the stuff you're taught. So it doesn't surprise me that even today people say like, oh, the South is not great. Like they're slower with banning these racial discriminatory laws, and so they're gonna take a while to become more accepting.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good point to make. yeah, that's, I mean, where you're born and your local legislation and like law judicial system really has an impact on the way you see the world and other people. And
Hmm.
yeah, so I think that's a really interesting point to talk about. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, this case, I feel I'm like really grateful for these two people who fought so hard. I just feel so sad that, their whole life they had to spend fighting. I'm glad that it has a happy ending. I'd really like to see the movie to get more insight into what it was like, because I swear they just released a movie about this. Yeah, I think it'd be interesting to learn more about what they had to say about the whole experience and working with the ACLU and
Yeah. And the thing is too, they weren't activists, right? They're just normal people and they just wanted to be married. And so they didn't ask for, like, they didn't send it to the ACLU. Like Mildred just wrote a letter. They didn't think that it was gonna be escalated to that extent.
yeah, so I'm so sad that, they had to fight this fight when, it should have just been a guaranteed right.
Definitely. But also, it's eye opening because, during the civil rights movement, the Supreme Court unanimously agreed that this was discriminatory. And that says a lot about how important it is to have the right people in the right seats for government. Because if any of them felt like the Virginia Supreme Court ruled that no, we should keep that. And if that majority had been in the Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court, then you would see that outlawed for even longer. So representation in government is really, really important.
I
And
100% agree.
yeah,
One,
like don't take for granted the way if you're living in like a good country, it's because of good leadership, and that should be really acknowledged and respected and aspired to continue.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah. I also want to ask you too, how do you feel about this on both sides, right? Like when you meet, like what if it were reversed where it was like minorities? Well, actually not really, but like I have a lot of friends. I don't know if you feel this, but like as a mixed person, I just feel like people who are not interracial, like they don't come from interracial backgrounds, I feel like they have less interest in like mixed people, you know what I mean? Like that comes up with me for dating. Like if I'm talking to someone who's like their parents are both immigrants, I feel like they wouldn't want a mixed person coming into that. And that's something that surprised a lot of my friends, because a lot of my friends will be like maybe full Nigerian or full Indian, full Korean. And I always ask them like, what do your parents think about it? Or how would your parents feel if you married someone who wasn't Korean or whatever?
Mhm.
And they always say like, oh, like they wouldn't care, like it's not that weird. And then they're always surprised when I say I feel uncomfortable with that. But then I also ask them, okay, well then would you marry like someone who isn't? And they'd be like, no, I think I want to keep it like culture wise. So I'm like, okay, I see like a double standard in that, where I respect that you want to keep it in the culture, but that also would also imply that you would see interracial mixing as
Yeah,
lower than.
I think that's really important to point out that it's not necessarily, you know, just one-sided where it's white people being hesitant to mix, it comes from all sides. And so I think that's really interesting to point out, especially when we look at interracial marriage on a global context, because obviously this discussion is being held all over the world. And so, yeah, I guess, so I've spent time abroad in multiple countries, and most of the countries I went to were very homogenous. And so it's really interesting as a mixed person living in these countries talking about how, like my parents are from different ethnicities, and like kind of seeing, I guess, some people were, I guess, surprised and maybe like hadn't even in some extremes like hadn't even seen that as an option and had a lot of questions about what it was like to grow up that way. So yeah, again, it's not just I think it's important to reiterate that it's not necessarily just an American struggle or an American issue. It's all around the world. But I think, I don't know, I want to say that like maybe this is a cliche, but like with globalization, everyone it's like mixing and I don't know. Yeah, I the it's difficult. Yeah, I don't know what else to say.
Yeah, I think there's layers to it. I think like I guess the way I grew up in a very homogenous like area, that might be why I have these preconceived notions with it. But I think it's also a valid feeling of like what makes people feel like a little lesser than, because like people who come from interracial marriages, like I didn't meet another mixed person till I was 27, like in 2017 when I studied abroad. That was like my first mixed friend. She was like half Swedish, half Korean. And I was like,
Mhm.
where have you been all my life? Um, and she like you don't have to explain anything when you meet another mixed person, like they just get it. And
Yeah, I think well, yeah, I remember because like when we first met, that was something we bonded over really quickly. I think I had a very different experience because growing up, I grew up in Chicago, which is I guess a lot more diverse in rural Ohio. So
yeah.
I was lucky to be surrounded with multiple ethnicities. So I guess growing up, I didn't really think too much about it. I do like I think a lot of uh multi-ethnic people, mixed people kind of have the same challenge where like you have to balance or you feel like maybe you're not equally accepted on both sides and it's always kind of hard to you almost feel like you're struggling to like choose which side of your family um, you relate more with and it's kind of hard to like accept not I guess it's I feel like for me personally, it's easy to accept that I'm mixed. Maybe when I talk to other people, it's harder for them to accept that I'm mixed and like that I'm equally both ethnic, like multiple.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, but
I
then
get a lot of questions on like, what do you identify as? Like, what did you put on your college application?
was
And I'm like, it's not a choice. Like, I'm equally both, so I put both down.
well, yeah, and that's the thing. Yeah, that was always a thing growing up. Like whenever we took examinations, like ACT or whatever, like you have to check which race you are, and yeah, it was always really sometimes the way it's worded it makes it really difficult, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and it's really confusing, especially as a Latino. Like, there's always like Hispanic. Are you white Hispanic? Or are you not white Hispanic? And so it's like all these like different boxes. I'm like, why? I don't know. I guess I never. Yeah,
Right. Yeah.
it wasn't until I started living abroad and then I realized that like I was really lucky to grow up where I did because I feel like I was more accepted. And then then I went to certain countries where it was very, you know, homogenous and there aren't really any mixed couples at all. And so I guess maybe I had taken it for granted earlier, but then I was really lucky to be in a position too where I could share my experience as a mixed person and like kind of share why it's super awesome.
Yeah. I think it's something that you appreciate more with time too, because when you're little, like, it might just be like the vein to your existence. Like, it was the vein of my existence to be half Asian. And I remember, but I know that like in some East Asian countries, a lot of the time you're really, really looked down upon for being mixed. And that's
Mm,
like
yeah.
dual citizenship's not allowed, all these things.
Yeah, no, it's a really complex issue, and yeah, in different countries, yeah, you know, in different parts of the world, I feel like you get a different vibe. So it's
Definitely.
very complex, but
Right. And that's a result of government leadership.
yeah, don't take government leadership for granted. Yeah.
Right. If you like, representation is very important.
Yes, 100%. Yay, vote 2020.